If you think a Mini Cooper is too small and the Mini Countryman is too big, then Mini has a solution for you in the new Aceman. Now, the Mini Aceman is a compact electric crossover which essentially goes head-to-head with vehicles like the Volvo EX30 and therefore by extension the Zeekr X and the Smart #1. In terms of the EV gubbins, the Mini Aceman in Malaysia is powered by a 50 kilowatt-hour battery with power going to the front wheels via a single electric motor. As a result, this car 0 to 100 time is not that peppy and its range is only estimated to be about 400 kilometers, which means that compared to the Volvo and Smart, this car is a little bit at a disadvantage. However, the Mini Aceman does have a huge advantage in terms of style, and that's because even though this is a sort of middle child between the Countryman and the Mini Cooper, the Aceman does carry the Mini family traits really well. So up front, you have full LED headlights replete with a customizable LED daylight running light signature. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that the eyes of this car do look a little bit somewhere between a Mini Cooper and a Mini Countryman, which is exactly what this car is. As you move further down, you still get the same hexagonal grille that we've seen before from Mini models, which is framed in a sort of brushed rose gold color, including the same color for the Mini badge itself, which gives it this very homogeneous look. Now, because the Mini Aceman is built as a crossover, that's why you get a little bit more prominent body cladding as well as a little bit more contrasting down on the bottom in order to make this car look like it's got a bit more of a bash plate. That's also why you will see probably from this angle, this car's very pronounced wheel arches, again to give it that slightly more crossover-y vibe. Now, Minis have always benefited from a sort of exuberant personality, and that is very evident from the side, because even though you still have the typical Mini 3-element design, it does look very characteristically Mini, even though the Aceman is a new model. Now, in terms of rolling stock, they're handled by a set of 19-inch Michelin E-Primacy tires, and the overall wheel design to me I think is quite pleasant. The wheels themselves are noteworthy because these tires are actually of a higher grade than the Maxxis rubbers that you used to get from the Mini Cooper SE, and so I appreciate the fact that they have listened to feedback and improved the tires. As we move further down the side, again you get a little bit more of that prominent body cladding there. You get these squared off wheel arch claddings here, repeat with a little bit of design elements here in order to sort of tie it in with Mini design language, and overall I do think that this car is quite successful to look at. Notable features include the flush door handles here, the same way we've also seen this from the Mini Cooper and Mini Cooper SE, as well as a little mini pill down there, which I think is quite interesting, and I believe that in other markets it's customizable, so you can have different designs to it, but there we are. Now, in terms of the overall dimensions, as I mentioned, this car goes head-to-head with the Volvo EX30, which is why its dimensions are broadly similar. Now, that has some benefits and some downsides, the benefits being behind the wheel, the downsides being overall capacity for people and things. But I think that as far as I'm concerned, the Aceman does at least look a bit more proportionate as a 5-door compared to the previous generation Mini Cooper 5-door, because that always looked a little bit weird. Now, the back of the Aceman also sees some familiar elements as well as some unfamiliar ones. So for example, we now get these customizable taillights repeat with a little signature animation every time you lock and unlock the car, which I think looks really characterful. And of course, you still get that same brushed gold material here for the Mini badge, as well as the Aceman badging here, as well as this bright yellow S badge to denote the fact that this is electric. Now, it is worth pointing out that the Aceman is not available with a combustion engine compared to the Countryman and the Mini Cooper, which are still available with petrol engines if you want. The Aceman is a pure electric model, so if you see one of these, you know that it's powered by electrons. Now, aside from that, I do think the overall rear treatment of this car is quite successful, and I like the fact that this car has very pronounced haunches down the side in order to emphasize the fact that 1, this is a Mini, and 2, this is a dynamically capable vehicle. And I do think that it makes this car look quite cute. I know quite a few people have passed comments on the way this car looks, especially from the rear. Now, one thing about the Aceman that I'm not the biggest fan of, or in fact Mini in general, is the fact that unless you buy a Countryman, the tailgate is not powered, which I think is a little bit of a shame given the fact this is a 220,000 ringgit car, but there we are. Now, opening the tailgate will reveal that you get quite a bit more space in here compared to the Mini Cooper, which means that if you're looking at a Cooper and then you thought that it might be a little bit too impractical, this again might be the solution for you. Now, obviously the space back here is not as big as what you get from a Countryman, but I think this is still perfectly usable for a family of 4 or for 2 adult passengers with children. And on top of that, this boot floor can actually be lowered in order to improve vertical space, and of course the rear seats can be folded 60/40 for added practicality. It is worth pointing out that even when the boot floor is in its lowest position, there is still space underneath that in order to hide your charging cables, which is great because this car doesn't have any space underneath the bonnet. Now, if you like the interior of the Mini Cooper, then you'll quite like the interior of the Mini Aceman because it is broadly the same. So you still get this very minimalist interior design, but it's very much in keeping with what Mini has done in the past, primarily from the first generation Mini way back when. And as a result, this interior does look very stylized and kind of retro cool, which I quite like. Now, the view in this car is dominated by this central touchscreen, which is the first use of a circular OLED display in the automotive industry, which is something that Mini does quite like pointing out. Now, this system actually runs an interface that is unique to Mini because obviously this system, while it might be, or it might have some relation to what we've seen from BMW iDrive, because this is a purely touch input system without a rotary controller, it had to be reworked in order for better ergonomics when you're using it as a touch screen. Now, one thing that I do appreciate is the fact that the graphics in this car are absolutely fantastic. This screen is very, very high resolution with a really good refresh rate, and as a result, all the information displayed here does come out very crisp and very pretty. And of course, when you add to that the certain mini touches to the way this car does things. So for example, the voice assistant in this car is called Spike, and he looks like a dog. He's very cute. And then you have the little power and battery gauges here where when the car goes into regen mode, a little sort of daisy pops up and it starts spinning and stuff like that. And so in order to have graphics like that, you need a really good screen and a really strong processor behind it. And I am happy to report that this screen does do that job pretty well. In addition to all of this, this screen also controls a lot of this car's functionality because there aren't that many buttons everywhere else, so everything's controlled through here, including your HVAC controls, as well as your wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. The only trouble is when you use phone mirroring, it comes out in this little square in the middle of the screen, leaving a lot of real estate that's not being fully utilized. And as a result, it does look a little bit janky. It doesn't look quite as smooth as in terms of integration as what we've seen from, say, Volvo or BMW. Now, the thing is, this is actually the only standard screen that comes with any Mini globally. We actually get a full color heads-up display as well, but that is unique to our market. In other markets, that's an optional extra. Now, having the heads-up display displayed on this piece of Perspex has its pros and cons. The legibility, for example, is fantastic, which means that even if you're wearing sunglasses like I normally do, you can still see all the information displayed there without any issue whatsoever. The only trouble is because it's projected onto that piece of Perspex and not the windscreen, it means that it actually sits a little bit lower than my eye line. And so as I'm looking out, as I'm driving along, while I can still sort of see it within my periphery, it's not really in focus. And so I wish that this had been slightly better implemented, but there we are. Now, beyond that, all the controls in here are very simple, and again, it is very minimized. So down here, for example, that's where you get a lot more tactile controls for your volume, your power switch, which I think is quite interesting because it actually resembles the key and the central sort of starter barrel that you used to get, again, from a Mini, an Austin Mini way back when, and your gear selector lives down here. There are a set of touch-sensitive buttons that live down here for your hazard light, your 360-degree camera, your vehicle settings, as well as your defoggers for front and rear. Now, beyond that, you may also notice that while you have a couple of air vents in front of the passenger and a single air vent on this side, there isn't actually a central air vent. But there is, because they've actually hidden it within a couple of vents that come out from below the screen and above this sort of center thing, and that's actually adjustable via a lever on this side, which I think is quite smart, and the gust of wind from here is actually quite strong. Moving further down, you get a couple of USB-C ports, a wireless charger here, you get a couple of cup holders, as well as this covered storage area, which looks a little bit like a sunglasses holder, and so I've naturally stuck my sunglasses in it. And then moving further back, there is a little bit more storage, as well as a couple more USB-C ports. You get a decently sized glove box, although this isn't lined in felt or rubber, which means that anything you put in there will rattle. And then as for the doors, it's not that practical. You can fit a liter-sized bottle here, but not much else, and the pocket that sits behind that isn't all that big either, which means that in terms of practicality, this car does have some degree of compromise. But ultimately, this is a Mini after all, which means that you kind of expect that because this car is meant to be relatively compact, and so I'm willing to forgive a lot of things within this car. What I can't quite forgive in the Aceman is the same thing I couldn't forgive in the Cooper, and that is the fact that material quality isn't all that great. So while you have this fabric up front replete with some really interesting contrast straps, and you also have more of that fabric here on the doors, and the seats are also done in this really nice sort of leatherette material replete with electric adjustment for both the front seats with memory functionality for the driver. When you stretch beyond that, things start falling apart a little bit. So for example, this is all hard plastic, but so is this, including the cowling for these buttons here. The plastics up here are also incredibly unforgiving, as well as the plastic for the Harman Kardon tweeters on the doors. This just isn't all that great, and for some reason, as I said Harman Kardon, the car's decided that I want to talk to it, which I don't. Which is actually quite sad, because I'm telling you, this little dog voice assistant thing is really cute. A lot better than Smart with the leopard, or whatever the one was for the hashtag one. Now, with the front seat set in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, you can see I have a pretty decent amount of knee room. And despite this car's diminutive size, I actually have a pretty decent amount of headroom at that. And so overall, I think that in terms of space, this car is not that bad. And even though this car is quite low, which might suggest that you don't have that much space for heads or feet for that matter, I think the accommodations back here are not that bad. Admittedly, I can't really stretch out underneath the seat in front of me because the floor actually rises to make space for more batteries. But even like this, I do have a decent amount of under-thigh support if this car were a strict 4-seater, because I do actually need some space to stretch out like this in order to get any degree of support whatsoever. This car is actually a 5-seater compared to the Mini Cooper, which is a strict 4, which means that you do actually get a 3-point seatbelt for this middle seat. However, the seat base is that wide. Now, I'm not sure if you know anyone, but I certainly don't know anyone whose ass is this wide. And if they are, they're probably a child, which means they should be in a child seat anyway. And so please do not consider this to be a 5-seater by any measure. Now, beyond that, appointments back here are not that bad. I've got a decently sized pocket behind the front seat. I've got really tiny door bins here, which are perhaps big enough for a 500-litre bottle, or maybe 750 if you're the kind of person that's okay with sort of jamming a bottle in there. But you do get a singular cup holder here and those 2 USB-C ports that I mentioned earlier. You also get more of that fabric here, but then again, everything else is hard, scratchy plastic. That includes the tops of the doors, as well as a lot of the door surrounds down here, as well as, rather annoyingly, the backs of the front seats, which is something that you might touch very often. However, I understand why the material here, at least, is this harsh, because if you were to put a rear-facing child seat, it might brush up against the backs of the front seats, and so you want a slightly more harder wearing material in order to weather that abuse. However, I think the act of fitting a child seat back here is going to be a challenge in and of itself, because these doors are generally not that large, and then they don't open that wide either, which means that trying to get a rear-facing child seat in here is going to be a bit of a palaver. The ISOFIX mounts themselves are not that bad, but for adult passengers, it is just slightly unfortunate that the back rest is at a very upright angle. I would have preferred this to be a few more degrees tilted in order to provide a little bit better support, a little bit better comfort, especially down here. But if you wanted a Mini Cooper that's a little bit more practical, then I suppose the Aceman is just about it. However, for overall practicality, both the Zeekr X and the Smart #1 are significantly larger than this and are much better at carrying rear passengers or bulky rear-facing child seats. The boots in those cars are also significantly larger, and so you are paying a premium for a premium brand. It doesn't matter if you're getting a Volvo or a Mini, you are paying a little bit more for ultimately a little bit less car. That said, however, the trading point of a Mini is ultimately its style, its character, and its drive. And since we've covered the fact this car is very stylish and very characterful, that just leaves one more question. Is this still a Mini to drive? Now, the important thing to remember about the Mini Aceman is that this car slots between the Mini Cooper and the Mini Countryman, which means that ultimately, if you're looking for a slightly more practical Mini Cooper, then this is basically it. Now, in doing so, I would also imagine that the driving dynamics of this car should also be sort of broadly between those two cars, where the Mini Cooper is very sharp and still maintains that go-kart-like handling that has made the brand famous for so long. It's also not quite as dulled and pedestrian as what you get from the Mini Countryman. Now, off the bat, when you drive the Mini Aceman, within a few meters you will realize that this car is not quite as soft or as pliant as the Mini Countryman. Obviously, the Countryman being built as a family car, it needs to offer that degree of comfort for its passengers. Whereas the Cooper is a bit more sharper in its dynamics and therefore has a slightly harsher ride, whereas the Aceman sits very nicely and very comfortably in the middle. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because while the Aceman is certainly not as plush as the Countryman, it is still very comfortable indeed. The primary ride in this car, while stiff, takes off the worst edges of the lumps and bumps that you might hit, whereas the secondary ride ensures that body control in this car is absolutely excellent. Also, in case you're wondering, the noise that you're hearing is actually the sound of the speed warning, because for some reason I can't seem to switch it off, and it also thinks that the road I'm on is a 30 zone, but there we are. So this car enjoys pretty good refinement at urban speeds, where road noise is relatively well suppressed despite this car riding on relatively large alloy wheels, and wind noise is also very well suppressed despite the fact this car builds itself as a crossover. I would have expected a little bit more in terms of wind whistle, but evidently not. On top of that, when you drive this car about in town, because this car has a pretty good Harman Kardon audio system, it means that you don't really hear much of the world around you. Instead, your focus is largely drawn towards whatever music it is that you might be playing at the time. When you get it up to motorway speeds, that's when you realize that because this car's slightly stiffer secondary ride, it means that that body control ensures a very confident sort of drive when you're at higher speeds. It means that when you're doing 110, 120 kilometers an hour, an exit ramp or an on-ramp is not really going to concern you that much. You can maintain that speed through corners, and more importantly, through evasive maneuvers, heaven forbid, you will be able to keep this car in check without too much issue whatsoever. This is certainly a plus point for this car, because while the EX30 also performs in a relatively confident fashion, other vehicles at around the 200,000 ringgit price point, such as the BYD Sea Lion 7, don't do nearly as well. And so you are paying for a little bit of dynamic ability in this car. And then, of course, at motorway speeds, the refinement doesn't really go anywhere. Of course, at 110, 120 kilometers an hour, it invites a little bit more in terms of road noise, but in terms of wind noise, it remains relatively well suppressed. This car is very, very well insulated, and so that is fantastic. However, if you were to drive in the motorway, that is when you discover one of this car's weak points, and that actually has to do with power efficiency. This is not the first time that we've bemoaned the energy efficiency in a BMW electric product, and so the Mini Aceman is no different. Now, in the time that we've had this car, it's claiming to do about 15-ish kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. Now, with that in mind, that means this car will do about 350 kilometers on a charge, very far from the claimed 400 plus or 400-ish kilometers that this car is supposed to do. As a result, that does mean that I would consider, and I suspect a lot of buyers would consider the Mini Aceman to be a primarily urban geared product, something that is meant to be driven in town and not much else. Because given the consumption figures on offer, and bear in mind that is with me driving, again, primarily in town, it begs the question as to whether or not this car will be efficient enough to be able to cover meaningful distance if you were to take it on a long distance drive. That to me is slightly disappointing, because vehicles like the Smart #1 and the Volvo EX30 are able to get a lot closer to their claimed ranges and do a lot better as potential long distance drive vehicles. And that, of course, invites even more disappointment, because unlike the Mini Cooper SE, the Level 2 semi-autonomy systems available in this car come as standard, or at least that's what's been explained to me in the model that I'm driving. Now, as a result, that means that you get essentially what BMW calls Driving Assistant Plus. I'm not sure what Mini dubs it as, but that gives you adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, lane centering control, lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, and all that nonsense. And as a result, it means that when you are on the motorway, if you were to take in a longer drive, you can allow the car to do the majority of the work, leaving you to feel comfortable and more relaxed and slightly less pressed about things. And of course, if you were to drive this car in town, then again, those same systems work very hard when you're stuck in traffic like me, for example. You can allow the car to sort of accelerate and brake for you, and so you just enjoy the serenity of traveling along in an electric vehicle. These are the features that I actually really wanted to see from the Mini Cooper itself, because the 3-door model that we've driven previously was a perfectly suited and perfectly calibrated city car with its size and its overall specifications. It was perfectly suited for town driving. It just lacked the Level 2 semi-autonomy that you would want from a car that you want to drive primarily in town. However, it is worth pointing out that the ADAS systems in the Mini Aceman are not quite as polished as what we've seen from the Volvo EX30. Of course, this doesn't come as much surprise to me, because Volvo has been doing ADAS systems for a lot longer than others. And of course, their systems have always presented themselves with a degree of polish. And so ultimately, if you were to compare this to, say, the Smart #1, the #1 has more range, yes, and it also has the smart connected features through the infotainment system, like the ability to route you through its inbuilt navigation to show you the live charging map. And then, of course, with the app, it also allows you to manage the charging session itself, so you never have to download 650 million different apps just to manage all the CPOs. And then you have the Volvo EX30, which obviously does not come with that live charging map, but instead it has Google Maps built in, which then allows the car to then be able to accurately predict or broadly predict how much battery is required for you to do certain trips. And as a result, it also means that it helps to manage your expectations when it comes to overall power consumption and how to plan your trips overall. And so both of those cars do better as compact electric vehicles if you want to take them out over a longer trip. However, if you're just driving about in town, then I do think that the Mini Aceman does do things pretty well. I think that it's very peppy and very fun to drive, which is certainly always nice to see, and again is in keeping with the Mini corporate identity. I love the fact that this interior is very characterful and very colorful, which is again in line with your expectations when it comes to the Mini brand. And compared to the Mini Cooper, I will admit the Mini Aceman does feel like a much more refined, much more grown-up vehicle, and therefore it is something that is a lot easier for you to live with day to day. Now, if you're looking for an electric hatchback that's fun to drive, but 220,000 ringgit might be a bit of a stretch for you, then consider the MG4 Electric, because you can get into a long-range model which offers decent performance, decent practicality for a much more affordable price point. And I argue that car is also a little bit more efficient with a little bit more range. However, if you want a premium, compact, luxury crossover experience, then I would argue that the Volvo EX30 might actually be the slightly better bet, because not only does that car come slightly better equipped and also offers a larger battery, better range and better overall efficiency, I also think that that car is a little bit more refined and just as fun to drive, although it merely lacks the sort of character that the Mini offers. But if you're smitten with the Mini identity, as so many tend to be, then I think that no matter what I tell you, this Mini Aceman is still going to be very appealing to you. And I completely understand why. This car has a lot of character to it, and for a lot of people that could be a major selling point. I get it. Believe me, I do. Which means that while this car isn't perfect, for a lot of people it might just be just the right companion that they're looking for. In any case, that concludes our review of the new Mini Aceman. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.